If you go to the class webpage, you're going to find a document entitled Research Binders. You should open it up and you can follow along as I talk about things and maybe take notes on the side where I elaborate on what's actually in the document itself. For every conference, the delegates are going to prepare what I call a research binder. Now, the sections in the research binder that I'm about to describe are not recommendations. They're instructions. I'm expecting to see research binders that have each of these sections and in the order that I'm talking about, and I'm expecting them to look like professionally done, not printed up and everything, but they should be organized. I don't want to see a research binder that has a bunch of paper stuffed into it, that looks like it's been, thrown around the room. I want something that looks good. Not just for visual reasons, but because the better it looks, the more organized it is. And the more organized it is, the more useful it's going to be. Now, I'm not going to evaluate the research binders solely on the basis of how complete they are. In other words, I'm not going to evaluate them just on how well each of the sections is filled in. There has to be some indication that you've actually read the documents in your research binder. For example, at one point in the research binder, I expect you to go ahead, when it's appropriate, to print up UN resolutions or conventions or agreements that are relevant to the topic under consideration. But just going ahead and printing up every document you can find and just sticking them in there doesn't do you any good, and it doesn't impress me. I want you to print up the ones that you think are relevant, and I want to see some indication that you've looked at them, that you've read them, that you've looked at the material. So I'm not expecting you to waste a bunch of time reading UN resolutions. That's boring. But by going ahead and doing research, you should be able to find resolutions that are important. And even then, you can look at individual sections within a resolution and go ahead and identify, maybe just read some of the sections. Now, some prefer to go ahead and do a research binder on their laptop, right? Now, here's one thing that I want to say about that. So in some cases, people will just print up all the documents that they've been reading. In other cases, some people just want to do it online. Here's the only thing that I would say about that. You're not going to have access to your laptop during formal sessions. So when you're in formal debate, as people are giving speeches, or you're not going to be able to have your research binder available to you. So it could be that in a speech, a delegate gets up and says something that you're like, I don't think that's true, right? If you have your research binder on your computer, you won't be able to check it. But if you're familiar with your research binder, you know where it is. You flip over, you go ahead and you see it. It's like, man, raise your placard, because next time you get up there, you can say, the delegate from Denmark suggested that this is the case, but in fact, this is the case, and you can go ahead and respond, but you have to have that information right there. Also, as delegates are making points, if you know you're on the speakers list and you're trying to think about some things to say, you can refer to your research binder, and you can do it, while they're talking. If it's on a computer, you can't. So all research binders should, if you're going to print them up, should include some blank sheets of paper, either at the beginning or the end, for taking notes during the conference. And when you hand me in your research binder, those notes should be there. So don't throw anything away. Just have your notes there. And I don't care if they're scribbled. I don't care if they make sense to me. I just want to see that they're active. Now, you're not going to be able to save like diplomatic notes that you send to other people. Don't worry about that. But just your own notes that show like when you're thinking about what you're going to say, other comments other delegates are making, ideas that you have, things like that. If you're in a committee using a speakers list, what you should also do, having your research binder and maybe tucked into the little folds they have, is before you get to the conference, have a bunch of notes to the dais asking to be added to the speakers list. No need to be writing it up while you're in committee, right? You can go ahead and you have one with you. Maybe you put 10 of them in there. And every time you go up to give a speech, just grab one out of your research binder, hand it to the dais, and do your speech. And then walk back and sit down. You don't have to worry about writing anything up. You don't have to worry about remembering to write it up. It's going to be right there, ready to go. If you have a digital research binder, be sure to bring blank paper as well on which to take notes during the conference. So either way, there's going to be some paper involved. So if you have a digital one, bring some sort of notebook along where you can go ahead and write notes. Now, the research binder should include each of the sections that I'm going to talk about. The guidelines were originally designed for delegates in the General Assembly and specialized committee. So delegates who are in the crisis committee should follow the same basic guidelines, but when appropriate, make adjustments based on what kind of committee that you're actually in. The first page of the first section of every research binder, other than the blank papers, should go ahead and include the awards section, right? The awards section just basically describes what chairs look for when they're going ahead and they're giving out awards. I want you guys to be familiar with this. I want you to refer to this periodically. I want you to keep this in mind as you're going ahead and preparing for the conference, and maybe when you get there, periodically looking it over and just reminding yourself what you should be doing and how you should be acting. Diplomacy is important. Understanding the rules of procedure is important. Your formal speeches are important, and resolution writing, which we talk about in a different video, is also important. The second section should be the rules of procedure that you're going to be using. Now, for those of you who are in the GA or specialized committees, the rules and procedures are going to tell you how your committee is going to operate, what you can do and what you can't do. In most cases, this is going to involve going ahead and printing up the rules overview that we have on the class webpage. But the truth is that they differ for every conference, not just what the rules are, but how they are applied. So you're going to have to go ahead and roll with the chair. But it's a good idea to have an easy reference summary of the most important rules and procedures in this section of your binder. And you'll find that there's a table in the rules overview that sort of gives you a breakdown of all the resolutions, all the motions and proposals that you can make, how many speakers for, how many against, and what they're made for. It's also a good idea to go ahead and include the flow charts in there, and then I'm going to post something on the class webpage entitled Delegate Terminology. This is going to be the actual terminology that you use in given when you're making motions, so that you have that at your disposal. But you should already know this. When you walk into a committee, this is something that you should already know. You should be familiar with the language. But sometimes, you're caught up in the middle of things, especially if it's your first conference. Just have them there. You can refer to them. So if you raise your placard and they call on you and you're going to go ahead and make a motion to set the agenda, then you can go ahead and look down, make sure you have the proper terminology. In section 3, and by the way, this is one of those cases where if you have a digital research binder, you can't refer to the terminology because you won't be able to open your computer during formal debate. The third section has to do with information about your committee. Now again, the goal of a committee is to go ahead and pass a resolution or solve a crisis if you're in a crisis committee. Now in theory, as it pertains to people who are in the GA and specialized committees, your proposals, whatever your proposals are, should be limited in scope to what your committee is actually permitted to do in the real world, right? If you're in the General Assembly, or if you're in the World Health Organization, or if you're in the legal committee, whatever it happens to be, there are certain things you're allowed to do and certain things that you're not allowed to do. Oftentimes what you're going to see is that delegates from other colleges will go ahead and make proposals that are completely outside the mandate of their own committee. They're proposing to do things that their committee doesn't have the authority to do. Now, sometimes chairs will catch them, sometimes they won't. I don't care about the chairs. Don't make that mistake. I want you to go ahead and I want you to be proposing things that your committee is allowed to do. So to ensure that your proposals are within the scope of your committee's mandate, you should include material in this section that explains what your committee can do, what it's not permitted to do, and you should be familiar with that. So when you're devising your strategy for what you're going to do when you go to the conference ahead of time, you should already have an idea. What am I allowed to do? What am I not allowed to do? What's our mandate? What are we permitted to do? You should also be familiar with key decisions, resolutions, or actions taken by your committee, right? So again, if you're in the first committee in the GA, you should know what they've done in the past, especially important documents, and especially ones that are referred to in the background guide. Also, it's a good idea to go ahead and look at, especially if your committee is situated in like real time, go ahead and look up your committee and see what they've done recently. See what they've done in the past 6 months. There have been some instances where people have been in committees where their committee in the real world took action days before. In one case, it was the night before a committee took action. When you walk in there, if you're one of the few or only delegates that know that, oh yeah, you know what, this is the action we took last night, right? You're in great shape. So the better you know, the more you know, the better. If you're in the GA, or you're in the Security Council, or if you're in ECOSOC or something like that, the source of your committee's power is going to be listed in the UN Charter. So if you're a UN Charter created committee, go ahead and look at the UN Charter and see what you're allowed to do. If you're in a specialized committee, you need to locate the founding document, the document that created that. So the World Health Organization. If you're in the World Health Organization, find the document that created the World Health Organization, look inside it, look at its constitution essentially, and see what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. Same thing with if you're in a specialized committee. You've got to look and see what you're allowed to do. If you are in a crisis committee, right, one of the things you're going to have to do is look at your character's portfolio, is what it's called, the portfolio. That's basically where they describe what your powers are and what your powers, and where it extends. But in this case, if you're in a crisis committee, you also need to look at the portfolios of the other members who are in your committee. You not only need to know your power, but you need to know what else they can do, what else they're allowed to do, where their power extends. That way, if somebody takes an action that is beyond their scope, go ahead and you can object to it, or you can take some sort of action to resist it. If you have that in your research binder and they take some action, right, you'll be able to look through your research binder. If you're thinking to yourself, I don't think they're allowed to do that, then you can go back to your research binder and look it up and go, wait, now it says right here, this is their power. And then you can go ahead and devise a way to respond to it. Whether you're in the next section, section 4, if you're representing a country, right, your research binder needs to include essential information about your country using the guidelines that are discussed in the research binder document. You're not expected to memorize all of the material, right? What you need to do is you need to have more than a passing familiarity with each category. The government, the economy, trading partners, regional organizations that you belong to, all those kinds of things. But you need to know something about your country, and here's why. Very, very embarrassing situation where, I forgot what committee it was, a delegate was representing some country, I think it was like Kazakhstan or something like that. So they were representing a country not very well known. And they had proposed to deal with a particular situation. They had proposed to have a conference in their country to go ahead and discuss this particular matter. So the committee was all fine with that, and they said, okay, let's go ahead and do that. So they started to write up a resolution to go ahead and get that done. And at one point, somebody else in the committee said, just assuming they were going to meet in the capital, they turned to this person, they said, what's the capital of your country? And the delegate didn't know. They didn't know the capital of their country. It was very embarrassing. And then to make it worse, I just happened to be sitting in the room then. Like I was in the room when that whole thing happened. Completely embarrassing. So you need to know this stuff. Now, there's a list of information in the research binder, a bunch of links that will help you identify areas where you can go to get this information. You'll also find a number of links to sources, a number of sources that you can use to gather this. So take a look at them all, but some of them are going to be duplicative, so you don't need to, for example, go to the CIA fact book and then go to the BBC profiles and then do 3 or 4 different ones. Just make sure you have a complete picture of the overall picture of your country, so that if during debate something comes up, you can flip through it and go ahead and find it out. Section 5 is really simple. The background guide should be in Section 5. Your background guide should be printed up. And again, what I'd like is some indication that you've actually read it. Now, that can be if you're reading it online and you're just reading it, on your computer, then there should be something like notes or something that indicate that you actually read it. Anybody who just reads their background guide and takes no notes, they're not memorizing it, they're not thinking about it, they're just skimming it. So there should be some sort of indication, whether it's other documents that you've researched because of the fact that you looked at your background guide, whatever it happens to be, there needs to be some indication that you pored over your background guide. Section number 6 sort of aligns with what I talked about before. You also want to look at just current events, not just necessarily what your committee or what the UN has done, but you want to know current events, just what's happening in the news if you're representing a country, knowing what's going on in your country. If your country has just had an election, you should probably be aware of that. Right? So in case somebody asks about or makes some comment about the elections in your country, you're not, oh, we had elections? You know what they're talking about. If you're in a historical committee, you should familiarize yourself with events that happened around the time that your character was alive. So you should know about what the actual topic is, but know a little bit about the time frame that you're in. Be a little bit aware of it. Knowledge of events that are adjacent but not directly connected to the events that you're going to be studying can come in very handy. If you're a committee situated in the future, you should try and familiarize yourself with events that preceded the time that you're going to be acting in. So if your committee is meeting in 2025, you want to go ahead and look at things that happened most recently that led up to that point, that preceded that point. That can be a little bit more complicated, so just use good judgment as far as that goes. Section 7 deals with UN resolutions, treaties, and conventions. It's extremely important that delegates in the committee, especially ones related to the United Nations, are familiar with what the organization has done on the topic. I provided a number of links that you can use to go ahead and find resolutions that have been passed on your topic by the United Nations. Usually what we're talking about in this section are more foundational ones, the basis by which you're acting. So you want to find more foundational things. Now, there's a strategy for finding these things. The way to do it is if you're looking at the empowerment of women, and that's your topic, if you look for a resolution that was passed recently, right? If you go to the preamble of that resolution, one of the things you'll find references to older documents that have passed. This is what they do in UN resolutions all the time. So you don't have to go ahead and search them yourself. Find a resolution, a relevant resolution that deals with the topic at hand. Look at the preamble. It will reference older resolutions that have been passed. Then you can look at those older resolutions and then see if they mention other documents as well. If you look at 3 or 4 different documents and you see the same resolutions mentioned time and time and time again, those are the important documents. Those are the ones that you need to know. You don't need to memorize it, but you need to know the basic idea behind them. So that's the way to go ahead and approach it. Then Section 8 is the most important. Section 8 is by far the most important. This is the section where you go ahead and you put your ideas down, what you plan to do once you get into committee. You can do all the research you want, but if you want to be effective at a conference, you need to think out ahead of time and summarize your ideas ahead of time. This portion of the binder should include your proposals for addressing the topics under consideration by the committees. Your proposals should also include things like which agencies would carry things out, what kind of funding mechanisms you plan to use to go ahead and carry it out. You just can't pretend that money falls from trees. We can talk about this more as you develop your proposals, and you can talk to me or you can talk to the veterans about how you fund proposals. For each of the proposals, as we talk about when we talk about resolutions, when resolutions have both a preambulatory section and they have an operative section. The preamble is sort of the the groundwork, why you're taking a particular action. The operative is what you're actually doing. So when you're going ahead and you're doing this section and you have ideas about what you're going to do, what you can do is you can write out your ideas in preamble form or in operative form. You can go ahead and put down your ideas and actually get them in that form. So you might have an idea for creating an organization to go ahead and keeping track of a certain kind of data, right? Well, you could just write out, let's create an organization that tracks certain kind of data. That's very vague. In a resolution, you're going to want to go ahead and be very specific about it. So what you can do is write out ahead of time, write out your resolutions, write out the ideas in resolution form, which we'll talk about elsewhere. But one of the things you have to remember is that you're not supposed to walk into a committee with a pre-written resolution. So the idea isn't to go ahead and pre-write it and then give it to somebody and say, let's do this. The idea is to essentially practice writing it ahead of time. So when you're in committee, you've already thought through this idea. If somebody else has introduced new ideas, you just incorporate that in. But having already practiced writing it out, you'll have an idea of where you need to go. For delegates who are in the crisis committees, your end goals should be specified in the SOFT approach. Right, and if you haven't looked at that, go ahead and look at the SOFT approach. And so what you should have in this section of your binder, again, which is the most important, are the directives, personal, joint, and committee, which will be a little bit harder, but especially personal directives and communiques, ideally in sequential form, that sort of show how you're going to be building to a certain end goal. So once again, for those of you in crisis committees, things happen really fast in crisis committees. People are talking, people are sending notes around, you're trying to write directives. The more you have this planned out, the better. So it could, in theory, work out that as you're going ahead and everybody's talking and you have this plan for what you want to do, you open up your research binder, remind yourself of what you're going to do, write it out, and then go ahead and hand it in. Having thought it out ahead of time, having written it out ahead of time, it's going to be that much easier when you go ahead and you do this. The research binder is really important. It's where you're going to summarize all of your information and you're going to put it together. The last section is critical. The last section is key. So make sure you do a good job on that, because more than anything else, that's what I'm going to be looking for. And that ends the section on the research binder.